Hey everyone, here on the Death Knight today, I'm going to be kind of going over a few things specifically with relation to rated battlegrounds here. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, I personally really don't care too much for arenas. They're a fun distraction in my mind, but I personally prefer RBGs quite a bit more. But I don't see a whole lot of videos dedicated to RBGs. A lot of people will make a video about arenas and they'll mention RBGs like in the last 30 seconds of the video. I'm going to kind of reverse that. I'm going to go over as much information as I can specific to RBGs, uh, playing a dual wield Death Knight in RBGs. Um, and then I might touch on arenas just a little bit, but mainly I'm going to focus on RBGs here. I'm going to go over a lot of things, talk about gear, talents and glyphs, damage, survivability, utility. I'll even touch on target calling, flag carrying, that sort of thing. Also, please keep in mind, a lot of what I'm going over here is very dependent on your playstyle, what comp you're running, what your role is within that comp, whether or not you're just straight damage, if you're going to be the flag carrier, if you're supposed to be spinning flags. Obviously, everyone does a lot of these different things, but how you approach your role is going to affect a lot of how this information applies to you. So please keep that in mind as I go through this, and we will get started. All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about here is just some general tips and ideas. Um, First thing I want to mention, I'm going to go over this a little bit later on in some of the different sections, but all of your cooldowns as a Death Knight, or virtually all of your cooldowns, have both offensive and defensive uses, which on the one hand is very good because it allows you to do a lot of different things with them, but it also means that you have to be considering what your particular role is right now in the RBG. Are you going for a kill? Are you trying to stay alive? What are you doing, and how do you want to best apply each of your cooldowns? And again, I'll touch on these a little bit later. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that right away. The second thing I want to talk about is your UI, your user interface, I mean, what you have here. Um, in an arena, I mean, at most, there's going to be 10 people in the arena total. In an RBG, you're going to have 20 people. So there's quite a bit more things to keep track of. I'm not actually obviously in a battleground right now. Usually I have battleground targets here and here. I highly recommend getting that mod, battleground targets. It's very, very convenient, very useful to have so that you can kind of see trinket cooldowns, levels, classes, specs, especially if you're target calling. It's a very useful add-on to have. Um, and then also just having different things, like personally I put my player and then target, that kind of thing here. That way it's all very easy to see. I can see it as I'm moving around, as I get, um, get going in here. I can see where everything is very easily. It also lets me keep track of my runes quite a bit easier. So just some very basic stuff there. Also, really quick, I wanted to touch on macros. In an RBG, you're not going to have a whole lot of macros, mainly because if you're trying to set up macros, in an arena, you'll set up a macro for each of your arena partners for several different abilities, plus each of the arena enemies for several different abilities, which works great when you're in like a twos or a threes match and there's only 4 or 6 people in the entire match. Whereas in an RBG, you've got 10 people on your team, 10 on the other team. If you're trying to write macros for all of those people, you're going to run out of space really fast. So most of what I use here is just going to be focus macros, like this one for strangulate, which also, if you're running asphyxiate, will change to asphyxiate. Howling blast macros, I got one for focus, icy touch, if I am running the icy touch glyph at that point. Kick macros, dark simulacrum, I'll talk about that a little later. So just basic macros there. One thing to kind of take a look at here, the base spell for one of your talents is in the line with Gorfine's Grasp and Desecrated Ground and all that. The base spell is actually called Grip of Death. So if you make a macro using Grip of Death, whatever you end up changing out the talent to will also change in the macro. So you don't actually have to worry about switching out macros and things like that. It's really convenient that way. So that is the end of that, and we will go into gear here in just a moment. All right, now we're going to get into gear. There are, that I've seen, there are three main ways that Death Knights will typically gear. Some will gear for mastery, some will gear for versatility, some will gear for haste. In an RBG, in a rated battleground, all three have their uses, but they are somewhat special. Some of them are somewhat specialized, so it kind of depends on, again, what your role is in your particular battleground comp. So I'll just go over the three of them here. The first one, most common one, is going to be mastery, because it's just straight damage, increases your frost damage done. Very simple, very easy to understand. Most of what we do is frost damage. Howling Blast is frost damage, Frost Strike is frost damage, even Chains of Ice is frost damage. It also counts for things like Death Siphon, which is shadow frost damage, or Necrotic Plague, which is also shadow frost damage. All of those are going to be increased by your mastery, which means virtually everything you do is going to be increased by your mastery. The only things that aren't are going to be things that obviously don't deal frost damage. Death Strike, Obliterate. I don't think Plague Strike, no, physical damage, so Plague Strike's not affected by it. But pretty much everything else is. And I'll kind of get into rotation a little bit later on. But most of what you do is affected by mastery, so it's a very, very good damage build to use. A little bit lower on survivability, and also as far as spinning flags and things goes. I'll talk about that in a minute. But as far as overall just damage goes, if your job in the battleground is damage, especially if you're not going to be focused very much, if the enemy team is most likely going to be focusing someone else on your team, the healers, casters, that sort of thing. It's a great spec to go with. Personally, I'm not currently running it. I'm running the second one that I want to talk about here, which is versatility. Versatility is a very tanky build to use. You'll notice here I got almost 9% versatility, basically unbuffed. It's a very, very good way to run. Increases damage and healing done, and decreases damage taken, which is very useful actually, because it not only affects obviously your damage, but it also affects self-healing as well, and then decreases damage taken. So if you have to go defensive, if you're using Death Strikes, Death Siphons, that sort of thing, it's going to increase the damage they deal, and also the healing that you take from them. So it kind of is a twofer right there. You're getting benefit from both of them. So very, very tanky here. It's very useful. Personally, I prefer the versatility build, but it's by no means is it the only build to use. If you are being focused, if you do have to go defensive very quickly, your spread damage is going to suffer a little bit. And I'll go into that a little bit later when I talk about rotations and things. But other than that, it is a very, very useful build, very tanky, very, very easy to survive and to stay alive with that. And the third build to use is haste. Haste is really nice. Haste increases obviously attack speed and rune regeneration. If you happen to be your group's primary flag spinner, like obviously in a flag map like Battle for Gilneas, Eye of the Storm, whatever map it happens to be. If you happen to be the primary flag spinner, haste might be a good build to go with, primarily due to increasing your rune regeneration speed. Obviously, I'm not running a haste build right now. I mean, I'm enchanted for versatility on everything. If you're enchanted for haste, you can get your rune speed down near 7 seconds, which is pretty good. It's going to give you more Howling Blast, which is going to allow you to do quite a bit more flag spinning, and that sort of thing. Also, coupled with things like Plague Leech and Empower Rune Weapon, things like that, you're going to be able to interrupt a whole bunch of flag caps if that's what your job is. If not, maybe the haste build is not something for you. And I admit the haste build is probably going to be the lowest damage of the three. Um, but again, they all have their uses. Different people are going to be doing different things in a rated battleground. One of them will work for you. It just kind of depends on, like I said, your comp, your role within the comp, and how your particular playstyle works. So those are the three gear builds, and we will move on from that. All right, and now we're going to talk about talents. I'm going to go over the talents that I personally prefer the most, kind of a little bit why I prefer them. In your first tier, you have Plague Bearer, Plague Leech, Unholy Blight. Plague Bearer is a good talent. It's not the best talent, though, in my opinion. Plague Leech is going to take that cake, mainly just because it gives you so much more utility. It does activate 2 fully depleted runes as death runes, even if you're using Necrotic Plague and there's only one disease on the target. The other thing that's very good to note about Plague Leech is it doesn't use all of your diseases. You know, if you're using Howling Blast and you have diseases on, you know, a whole range of targets, you got a lot of spread damage. It only uses the disease on your current target. One good thing to think about there is if your kill target happens to be dispelled, someone dispels your disease off the target and you suddenly need to use Plague Leech, you don't actually need to reapply it. You can just, I mean, you do want to reapply it because it's more damage on the kill target, but if you need to use it, you can tab target, pull it off of a different target, and then go back to your kill target and use the death runes that you've just gotten from the other target to reapply diseases to that target to get more damage on them, that sort of thing. Very, very useful in that sense. The next tier, you've got Lichborn, Anti-Magic Zone, and Purgatory. Lichborn is going to be the only viable talent here. I can think of a few niche uses for the other two, but I mean, just being honest here, Lichborn is going to be the only real viable talent. And as I said before, on most of these and the other cooldowns, they are going to have both offensive and defensive uses. Very good things to keep in mind. Lichborn gets you out of fear, saps, that sort of thing. And then also defensively gives you a 10% leech, which is very useful, especially if you're running that versatility build like I talked about. It just gives you even more healing in that point. In your 58 tier, Death's Advance, Chillblains, and Asphyxiate, personally, I prefer Chillblains. Even if, I mean, Asphyxiate is useful if you're running with a caster heavy comp that doesn't have a whole lot of stuns. But even in that comp, I still personally prefer Chillblains because it's very useful if you're trying to slow down a flag carrier, if you're trying to just keep someone slowed. You know, druids, you can usually keep it active on druids fairly regularly, not 100%, but quite a bit. And then also personally, I like to have Strangulate. I like to have a silence available instead of the stun. So again, it comes kind of down to play style, what you want to have available versus what is available. In moving on to the level 60 tier, Runic Corruption, Runic Empowerment, and Blood Tap. In this one, both Blood Tap and Runic Corruption are viable. Personally, I prefer Runic Corruption. This one goes back to your play style. Runic Corruption is going to be, in my opinion, most useful for dual wield Frost, since you are using Frost Strike quite a bit to deal damage. You're going to end up getting a lot of these procs that are going to increase your rune regeneration rate, which again is going to let you do more spinning, more Howling Blast, that sort of thing, which then just gets you more runic power to spend, and it keeps the cycle going. Some people prefer Blood Tap. Blood Tap is a little bit more predictable, especially you can macro Blood Tap in to a lot of your abilities. Blood Tap is not on the global cooldown, so you can macro it into a lot of your abilities and use it almost passively, and just every time you get 5 charges, it'll automatically go ahead and spend those to give you back a rune. Personally, I've tried that. I don't particularly care for that playstyle, but it is a viable way to play through the game. Level 75, you got Death Pact, Death Siphon, and Conversion. Death Pact isn't bad. The healing absorb for 25% of your maximum health for 15 seconds. I'm not a big fan of that, especially if you're a flag carrier or something like that, and you're trying to, your team's trying to heal you, you're trying to heal yourself. That's kind of rough. I'm not a big fan of that. Death Siphon is pretty awesome, partially because it's got a 40-yard range. You can use this when you're running away from people. If anyone's familiar with hunters, using jump shots and things like that, where you turn around while you're in the air to hit it. It's very useful. All of them, as far as I'm aware, all of them are affected by versatility as well. So that makes them all very good. And then Death Siphon, yes, it uses a death rune. That's a rune that you could have used for Howling Blast. So you are losing a little bit of damage there. But if you're having to play defensively anyway, you're probably going to be focusing more on staying alive than doing as much damage as possible. So there's a trade-off there. And like I said, Death Pact absolutely is viable. Conversion is not, just because it uses runic power, and we want to be spending our runic power on Frost Strike, which again is going to give us better correlation with runic corruption, which will give us faster rune speed, which will give us more death siphons, which will help keep you alive longer. And then I guess also using Plague Leech, you can pull your disease off of a target, get 2 death runes, use Death Siphon again. Death Siphon also will generate runic power, which means you can get more damage that way from runic corruption, use more Death Siphons, and again, it's a circle there. So very useful there. In your level 90 tier, you've got Desecrated Ground, Remorseless Winter, and Gorfine's Grasp. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the intro section on macros and things like that, these all share a base spell, so go ahead and use that in a macro. This is mine here. Go ahead and use that in a macro, and if you change from, like, for example, if you change from Desecrated Ground to, oh, I'm in combat here. If you change from Desecrated Ground to Gorfine's Grasp, there we go. If you change from that, you can, like you can see here, it went away and then came back as Gorfine's Grasp. So very, very useful there. In RBGs, both Gorfine's Grasp and Desecrated Ground are going to be very useful. Desecrated Ground, as everyone says, it's basically like another trinket, useful for getting out of, stuns, roots, snares, all of that sort of thing. Very, very useful. It's a great talent to have. Personally, I prefer it, but you don't necessarily have to run it. Gorfine's Grasp, on the other hand, very useful, especially if you're trying to set up kills and things like that. You can't use Gorfine's Grasp into a explosive trap, for example. I've seen some people do that. I've actually done that with Death Grip. If you have a hunter on your team, you can use Death Grip into an explosive trap to kind of knock some people around, that sort of thing. It's a lot of fun. You cannot use Gorfine's for that, but you can use Gorfine's into, for example, a solar beam, a druid's solar beam to get silences and that sort of thing. So it can be very useful there. Depends on the comp you're running, depends on your job within that comp, and what you're expected to be doing. For the level 100 talent, really Necrotic Plague is the only viable talent in this tier. Defile's a tanking talent, is for PvE. Please don't use it in PvP, it's terrible. And Breath of Cindergosa, as much as I love Breath of Cindergosa, it's an awful lot of fun, especially if you're running a two-handed spec. As dual-wield Frost, you're going to be using most of your runic power, again, on Frost Strike. Running Breath of Cindergosa doesn't really help you with that. So the only viable one here is Necrotic Plague. All right, now talking about glyphs. A lot of glyphs are going to be things that you're going to be switching out depending on what you're doing. Again, like I said, a lot of this depends on the comp you're running, what your role is within the comp. The only glyph I would say is required is going to be Glyph of Runic Power. Struck by movement impairing effect, generate 2 runic power for every second for 5 seconds. That one I would say is pretty much required just because of the amount of runic power that we want to be using. It's going to be a very, very useful one to have. Glyph of Anti-Magic Shell, useful against caster teams, Shadow Priests, Warlocks, that sort of thing. Very good talent, or excuse me, very good glyph to use there. Empowerment heals you when you use Empower Rune Weapon. Good, again, if you're using versatility build, you're going to get a little more healing there. Not always the best one, especially if you're running the mastery build. If your job is damage, you may want to use a different one. A lot of people run Glyph of Dark Simulacrum. Very good to use. I'm actually going to do a whole section on Dark Simulacrum here in a minute, so I will talk about that later. I've played around with Enduring Infection. I'm not sure if I like it yet or not. It's kind of nice, to have diseases that are not dispellable, but I'm not sure it's worth losing all the damage that you have to lose for it. And then, of course, Glyph of Icy Touch. I'll be honest, running dual wield Frost, I have discovered I don't use Icy Touch very often, if at all. A lot of the benefit that you get from that one with the two-handed spec comes from Obliterate, giving you the next Howling Blast or Icy Touch to cost no runes. Very, very useful there, especially in conjunction with this one where you can use it to dispel a target. We're not using Obliterate very often, if at all, as dual wield, so it doesn't always, you're not going to get very many procs for that, so not the most useful in my opinion, but absolutely still viable as something that you can run, especially if your comp maybe is a little bit low on dispels and you want to have that ability available. Other ones, Shifting Presences, very useful. I'm going to talk about changing presences a little bit later on. That's a good one to use, especially if you're flag carrying. Swift Death, very useful if you're going against Shaman. You can kill their totems and you get that movement speed buff. Very useful there. So some very good glyphs here. Some other ones, Strangulate might be useful too. Obviously I don't have it, so maybe not that useful. But that is one that I've been wanting to get and start kind of playing around with a little bit. And then, the rest of them. If you're using minor glyphs, the only one that's really useful, I guess, is, well, no, two of them, I guess, that are useful. Glyph of Path of Frost lets you fall from greater distance without taking damage. That's pretty useful. And then, where'd it go here? Glyph of Resilient Grip. If your target's immune, the cooldown is reset. That one, I would almost say that actually is a mandatory minor glyph. It's very, very useful there. So that's your glyphs. They're pretty straightforward, and we will move along. Okay, dealing damage is largely going to depend on your comp as far as how you approach it, but for the most part, it's all going to be relatively the same. You are, as a dual wield DK, you are a spread damage class, so your number one priority is going to be keeping Howling Blast up. That being said, if you're on a kill target and that sort of thing, your first priority is going to be Frost Strike with a Killing Machine proc. That's going to be a lot of your damage. Without Killing Machine, then your next priority is going to be Howling Blast, both to keep the spread damage up and to generate more runic power. And then your third priority is going to be Frost Strike without a Killing Machine proc. And finally, your fourth priority, you'll notice I have Plague Strike on the bar. Your fourth priority is Plague Strike. You only want to use Plague Strike when you have a Unholy Rune to use for it. You're going to basically be using it to help stack Necrotic Plague and to increase, to gain more runic power. Again, obviously to use with Frost Strike. Those are going to be the main uses. You're almost never going to use Obliterate. I have it here in a modifier macro. Honestly, I could not tell you the last time I actually used Obliterate. It's not particularly useful. Generally, the runes are going to be better used for Howling Blast, which is going to give you, again, more spread pressure. As far as Burst goes, really you've only got your two cooldowns, your Pillar of Frost and your damage cooldown, or excuse me, your trinket, your on-use trinket. So those are really the only two you're going to be popping, both of those when you're at full runic power. You know, basically just go ahead and use everything else, generate your runic power, keep going, yada, yada, yada. And when you're at or near full runic power, preferably with a killing machine proc, pop both of those, go ahead and get your frost strikes in, go ahead and build back up. For some reason, apparently, oh, you know what, I didn't change my macro. So that's why that's not in there, but normally it would be in there. So that's a very good thing to have. Keep using those and then just keep going there. One interesting thing to note, as I had said previously, most, if not all, of your cooldowns can be used both offensively and defensively. Things like, for example, anti-magic shell. Damage absorbed, this very last part here, damage absorbed generates runic power. Well, if you use that offensively, that's just going to give you more runic power to use for, you know, your frost strikes, which then, of course, between your talents is going to regenerate more runes, which is going to let you use Howling Blasts more, which is going to give you more runic power. And again, it goes back in that circle, so very, very useful there. Also with Icebound Fortitude, if you know, if you call for a kill on a particular target and oh my god, you get stunned, you know, whatever, you can actually just use Icebound Fortitude to get out of the stun and give you immunity to stuns for 8 seconds, which is fairly useful. Same thing, Pillar of Frost, immunity to external movement like knockbacks. Very, very handy, especially if you're at, like, say, Lumber Mill. A Hunter's Trap or a Druid Typhoon, I believe it is, can't knock you off of the hill, which is kind of nice. So keep that in mind, but generally speaking, you're probably going to want to use these cooldowns defensively, though it is all completely viable to use them offensively as well. All right, now moving along to survivability. Your rotation is going to be similar to your damage rotation. Obviously, you're going to want to stay in melee range still as much as you can. May need to back out a little bit depending on what you're facing, what's happening to you, things like that, where your healers are. That's going to make a difference. But still, you're going to want to try and keep your diseases up on the target. However, you're going to be using more of your runes for Death Strike and for Death Siphon. Both of those are going to be very useful. Also keep in mind you want to use Plague Leech quite a bit for, again, Death Siphon, Death Siphons, Death Strikes, that kind of thing. You do want to be using your runic power still, because that will increase your rune regeneration speed. You also want to be keeping your keeping Howling Blast up to make sure you keep Necrotic Plague on the targets, which again is going to be useful for Plague Leech. But again, most of what you're going to be using for defensive work is going to be Death Siphon, Death Strike. If you have Death Pact, that would be another one to use. It is on a 2-minute cooldown, which that's another reason I personally don't like it, but it is a viable option. One thing to keep in mind as far as survivability goes, a lot of your damage cooldowns and even your damage trinket increases versatility by a lot. So, you know, you go there, you go up to 14.5% healing done, which can also be used to stay alive versus do damage. So if you need to use that for healing, that's going to help you heal up quite a bit more. Now I got mixed scrolling battle text here. I actually have it set to not show overhealing, so that's why there's nothing showing up over here, even though I am, you know, using Death Strikes and Plague Siphons and such. But that is one thing to keep in mind is, you know, your damage trinket can be used defensively to help heal you as well with the extra versatility. So there is that, and then obviously being able to use Death Strike and all that. You're going to want to make sure that you use as many abilities as you can: Anti-Magic Shell, Icebound Fortitude, you know, or Desecrated Grounds if you need to, Lichborn, Trinkets, Plague Legion. I mean, every ability you have, like I said, can be used offensively or defensively. Generally speaking, you're going to want to use them all defensively, AMS, Icebound, all that stuff. But you do have the ability to go ahead and use them offensively as well, as I had said previously. All right, I'm going to go ahead and talk about probably one of the most difficult spells to master the use of in the game. Relatively simple spell to use, but mastering it can be kind of difficult. Of course, I'm talking about Dark Simulacrum. A couple things to just get off the bat here. Triggered when the enemy next spends mana on a spell. Okay, first thing, obviously, the enemy must actually spend mana. So it's entirely worthless against any class that doesn't use mana. Death Knights, Rogues, Warriors, for example. Any of them, don't even bother using it. You're not going to be able to do anything. The one exception to that being if you can cast it on a Death Knight who has already cast it on someone else. For example, if I'm playing with a Resto Druid and an enemy Death Knight copies my Resto Druid Cyclone, I can then cast Dark Simulacrum on the enemy Death Knight to copy Cyclone when he casts the Cyclone that he just copied. So I can actually copy a copied spell, which is kind of interesting. Not terribly useful, but it's kind of interesting. But other than that, you don't bother using it on a non-mana class. It's not going to be useful for you. The other thing is the enemy has to actually use mana, so they have to finish the cast. This is one reason I typically don't use the Dark Simulacrum glyph in a rated battleground, because in order for you to copy the spell, the enemy has to actually use the spell on someone on your team, has to actually crowd control your team. So generally speaking, it's going to be better to interrupt that spell so that your teammate does not get crowd controlled than it is to copy the spell and let your teammate get crowd controlled. Now again, generally speaking, this isn't always true. Sometimes it's going to be worth copying the spell, especially if you're getting a polymorph or cyclone, something like that. But it is generally more useful to copy crowd control spells, things like Cyclone, Polymorph, Hex, Fear, that kind of thing, than it is to copy just fun spells. For example, Pyroblast, Dragon Breath, Hand of Freedom, that sort of thing. Interestingly, though, you can copy some fairly useful spells, things like Pain Suppression you can copy. That's kind of nice to have. You can also copy Divine Shield, which is the Paladin Bubble, and a Mage's Ice Block. One thing to note is it actually does not copy the target's talents and glyphs. So if a mage has the Ice Block glyphed to heal them, and then you copy it, the Ice Block will not heal you. But it will still prevent damage, that sort of thing. Same with the bubble, it'll prevent damage. Maybe not the most useful thing in the world, but a lot of fun. So not the most, in a rated battleground, it's not nearly as powerful as it is in an arena, in my opinion, which isn't to say you shouldn't use it, but it's much more selective in how it's used, because you do have to let someone on your team get crowd controlled before it's actually going to copy the spell. So something to consider there. Very useful spell, very difficult spell to master, but it's a good spell to have available. It's a good spell that to kind of keep in your back pocket and know that you're able to use it when you need to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and talk about target calling here. This is a fairly common thing. If you're playing a DK, you are very likely to be asked to be the target caller in an RBG. The reason for this is obviously you're a melee class. You're going to be able to be in there. You can generally see positioning fairly well. But also because of things like Death Grip, or if you're running at Gorfried's Grasp, you're able to position yourself and coordinate with your team to effectively score kills. You can use Death Grip to pull to pull an enemy out of line of sight, pull an enemy out of range of some of their healers, possibly score a kill that way. It's a very useful thing to do. So as a target caller, when you're talking, you basically want to never shut up. I'm going to go ahead and open up just so you can see here. I'm going to open up Battleground Targets. This is just the configuration here, but you can see how I have these set up here. Enemy players on my right, friendly players on my left. You're going to want to basically be keeping an eye on these and always select kind of before the battleground begins, start to be looking at the enemy players, healers, DPS. Start picking out which targets are going to be your preferred kill targets. Are you going to start out on the druid and then maybe make a hard swap to the monk? Are you going to start out on the monk and then maybe swap to a DPS? How are you going to go ahead and do it? And a lot of this is going to depend on the comp you're running. If you have, a very melee heavy comp, your target calling may be a little different than if you have a caster heavy comp, that sort of thing. First thing you want to do when you're target calling, never ever shut up. You need to be talking to everyone else all the time. Unfortunately, people tend to be kind of like, shiny objects. They'll be like, oh, attacking some target, and oh, hey, let's go attack the guy over here that you didn't mention ever. So you need to be saying, hey, we're on Dungeoneer's training dummy. You want to attack the training dummy. We're attacking the training dummy. Let's stay on the training dummy, guys. Okay, we're on the training dummy. Things like that. And one thing to keep in mind here also, if you're calling a target, generally you're going to want to call the target's name and class. So if you're on the let's say you have a disc priest named Frank. I don't know, maybe there's one out there. If you have a disc priest named Frank, you're going to say, hey, we're on the disc priest Frank, we're on Frank, attack Frank, attack the disc priest, we're on the disc priest, attack Frank. Some people prefer to just use the first letter. We're on the disc priest with an F, we're on the disc priest with an F, attack the disc priest with an F, we're going to go ahead and kill him now. Kind of use that as a strategy. Make sure you're letting people know as often as possible which target to be on. That way they make sure they're on the right target, you make sure you're on the right target. The other nice thing about battleground targets is you can set it up so that you know how many people are attacking your target, so you can kind of understand who's attacking your target, who's not attacking it, and that sort of thing. The other thing, being a target caller, you want to try and anticipate swaps. You're going to want to try and announce a swap before it actually happens. So you might say, we're attacking the priest, a priest with an F, we're attacking the priest. Okay, in 5 seconds, we're going to swap over to the Holy Paladin. Attacking the priest, swap to the Paladin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Kill the Paladin, we're attacking the Paladin. And kind of do something like that so that people are aware of what's going on, and you can see, okay, we had this, now we're moving over here, let's go kill this guy. The other thing to do as you're setting up that swap is to help coordinate CC. In 5 seconds, we're swapping over to the Paladin. I need CC on the priest and the druid. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Kill the Paladin, CC the priest and druid. We're on the Paladin, we're on the Paladin, we're on the Paladin. Kill the Paladin. That sort of thing. That way you make sure people know exactly what needs to happen. You need to be very, very vocal. Like I said at the beginning, never shut up. People need to know exactly what you're saying and what you're calling for. And then generally speaking, you also want to make sure that if you're the target caller, you're not the strat caller for the battleground. It can get very, very confusing if you have to do both, and it can get confusing to some of the people trying to listen to you, because they start to wonder, whether or not you're calling strat or you're calling targets and how that all works out. So bottom line, as a target caller, never shut up. Think about CC and think about swaps before they happen. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about here is flag carrying. DKs are not the strongest flag carrier out there, but they are not a bad flag carrier either. If for whatever reason, if your comp decides that they want you to be a flag carrier, you can still stay as DW Frost with basically this same talent spec. You're just going to want to kind of go back to what I talked about, survivability. We want to go ahead and play as defensively as possible. Can swap to Blood Presence? Some people say yes. A lot of people say yes, swap to Blood Presence. Personally, I've actually found that staying in Frost Presence isn't as bad as people say. It's maybe not the most viable, just because of the extra armor and stamina that you get in Blood Presence. But Frost Presence also helps increase your runic power generation and reduces the cost of Frost Strike, which means, again, as we go back to it, you're getting more Death Siphons, you're getting more Death Strikes because you have faster rune regeneration. because of your death strikes giving you faster rune generation through runic corruption. So you have more death siphons, more runic corruption, more death strikes. You're able to keep your diseases spread a little bit easier using Howling Blast once in a while. You can use Plague Leech to get your runes back, which of course then gives you more death siphons and more death strikes and that sort of thing. So it is possible actually to flag carry in Frost Presence. I'm not going to say that it's the best way to do it. I'm not going to say that Blood Presence is the best way to do it. What I'm saying is figure out how it works with your team and your healers and how you guys communicate and what is the best way for you specifically to do it. But other than that, I mean, basically you're going to want to run, if you know ahead of time that you're going to be the flag carrier, you can run Glyph of Empowerment as well. Very useful one to have there. If not, if the flag gets dropped, you end up carrying it. Don't worry about it. Just keep in mind that you can use all of your cooldowns defensively, just like everything else. So that's pretty much all I have for this, and we're going to go ahead and close it up here. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate you watching. If you have any suggestions for me, please do leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you disagree, if you agree, and then by all means, please like the video, share the video, show all your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be doing some more videos as well. So have a nice day, and I will see you later.